The Horror in the Burying Ground by H.P. Lovecraft for Hazel Heald. Part 1. When the state highway to Rutland is closed, travellers are forced to take the Stillwater Road past Swamp Hollow. The scenery is superb in places, yet somehow the route has been unpopular for years. There is something depressing about it, especially near Stillwater itself. Motorists feel subtly uncomfortable about the tightly shuttered farmhouse on the knoll just north of the village, and about the white-bearded half-wit who haunts the old burying ground on the south, apparently talking to the occupants of some of the graves. Not much is left of Stillwater now. The soil is played out, and most of the people have drifted to the towns across the distant river or to the city beyond the distant hills. The steeple of the old white church has fallen down, and half of the 20-odd straggling houses are empty and in various stages of decay. Normal life is found only around Peck's general store and filling station, and it is here that the curious stop now and then to ask about the shuttered house and the idiot who mutters to the dead. Most of the questioners come away with a touch of distaste and disquiet. They find the shabby loungers oddly unpleasant and full of unnamed hints in speaking of the long-past events brought up. There is a menacing, portentous quality in the tones which they use to describe very ordinary events, a seemingly unjustified tendency to assume a furtive, suggestive, confidential air and to fall into awesome whispers at certain points, which insidiously disturbs the listener. Old Yankees often talk like that, but in this case the melancholy aspect of the half-mouldering village and the dismal nature of the story unfolded give these gloomy, secretive mannerisms an added significance. One feels profoundly the quintessential horror that lurks behind the isolated Puritan and his strange repressions, feels it, and longs to escape precipitately into clearer air. The loungers whisper impressively that the shuttered house is that of old Miss Sprague, Sophie Sprague, whose brother Tom was buried on the 17th of June back in '86. Sophie was never the same after that funeral, that and the other thing which happened the same day, and in the end she took to staying in all the time. Won't even be seen now, but leaves notes under the back door mat and has her things brought from the store by Ned Peck's boy. Afraid of something, the old Swamp Hollow burying ground most of all, never could be dragged near there since her brother and the other one were laid away. Not much wonder, though, seeing the way crazy Johnny Dow rants. He hangs around the burying ground all day and sometimes at night and claims he talks with Tom and the other. Then he marches by Sophie's house and shouts things at her. That's why she began to keep the shutters closed. He says things are coming from somewhere to get her sometime, or to be stopped, but one can't be too hard on poor Johnny. Besides, Steve Barber always had his opinions. Johnny does his talking to two of the graves. One of them is Tom Sprague's. The other, at the opposite end of the graveyard, is that of Henry Thorndyke, who was buried on the same day. Henry was the village undertaker, the only one in Miles, and never liked around Stillwater. A city fellow from Rutland, been to college and full of book learning, read queer things nobody else ever heard of, and mixed chemicals for no good purpose, always trying to invent something new, some new-fangled embalming fluid or some foolish kind of medicine. Some folks said he had tried to be a doctor, but failed in his studies and took to the next best profession. Of course, there wasn't much undertaking to do in a place like Stillwater, but Henry farmed on the side. Mean, morbid disposition, and a secret drinker if you could judge by the empty bottles in his rubbish heap. No wonder Tom Sprague hated him and blackballed him from the Masonic Lodge and warned him off when he tried to make up to Sophie. The way he experimented on animals was against nature and scripture. Who could forget the state that collie dog was found in, or what happened to old Mrs. Akeley's cat? Then there was the matter of Deacon Levitt's calf, when Tom had led a band of the village boys to demand an accounting. The curious thing was that the calf came alive after all in the end, though Tom had found it as stiff as a poker. Some said the joke was on Tom, but Thorndyke probably thought otherwise, since he had gone down under his enemy's fist before the mistake was discovered. Tom, of course, was half drunk at the time. He was a vicious brute at best, and kept his poor sister half cowed with threats. That's probably why she is such a fear-racked creature still. There were only the two of them, and Tom would never let her leave because that meant splitting the property. Most of the fellows were too afraid of him to shine up to Sophie. He stood 6'1" in his stockings, but Henry Thorndyke was a sly cuss who had ways of doing things behind folks' backs. He wasn't much to look at, but Sophie never discouraged him any. Mean and ugly as he was, she'd have been glad if anybody could have freed her from her brother. She may not have stopped to wonder how she could get clear of him, after he got her clear of Tom. Well, that was the way things stood in June of '86. Up to this point, the whispers of the loungers at Peck's store are not so unbearably portentous. But as they continue, the element of secretiveness and malign tension grows. Tom Sprague, it appears, used to go to Rutland on periodic sprees, his absences being Henry Thorndyke's great opportunities. He was always in bad shape when he got back, and old Dr. Pratt, deaf and half-blind though he was, used to warn him about his heart and about the danger of delirium tremens. Folks could always tell by the shouting and cursing when he was home again. It was on the 9th of June, on a Wednesday, the day after young Joshua Goodenough finished building his new-fangled silo, that Tom started out on his last and longest spree. He came back the next Tuesday morning, and folks at the store saw him lashing his bay stallion the way he did when whiskey had a hold of him. Then there came shouts and shrieks and oaths from the Sprague house, and the first thing anybody knew, Sophie was running over to old Dr. Pratt's at top speed. The doctor found Thorndyke at Sprague's when he got there, and Tom was on the bed in his room with eyes staring and foam around his mouth. Old Pratt fumbled around and gave the usual tests, then shook his head solemnly and told Sophie she had suffered a great bereavement, that her nearest and dearest had passed through the pearly gates to a better land, just as everybody knew he would if he didn't let up on his drinking. Sophie kind of sniffled the lounger's whisper, but didn't seem to take on much. Thorndyke didn't do anything but smile, perhaps at the ironic fact that he, always an enemy, was now the only person who could be of any use to Thomas Sprague. He shouted something in old Dr. Pratt's half-good ear about the need of having the funeral early on account of Tom's condition. Drunks like that were always doubtful subjects, and any extra delay with merely rural facilities would entail consequences, visual and otherwise, hardly acceptable to the deceased's loving mourners. The doctor had muttered that Tom's alcoholic career ought to have embalmed him pretty well in advance, but Thorndyke assured him to the contrary, at the same time boasting of his own skill and of the superior methods he had devised through his experiments. It is here that the whispers of the loungers grow acutely disturbing. Up to this point, the story is usually told by Ezra Davenport or Luther Fry, if Ezra is laid up with chilblains, as he is apt to be in winter. But from there on, old Calvin Wheeler takes up the thread, and his voice has a damnably insidious way of suggesting hidden horror. If Johnny Dow happens to be passing by, there is always a pause, for still water does not like to have Johnny talk too much with strangers. Calvin edges close to the traveller and sometimes seizes a coat lapel with his gnarled, mottled hand while he half shuts his watery blue eyes. "Well, sir," he whispers, Henry went home and got his undertaker's fixings. Crazy Johnny Dow lugged most of 'em, for he was always doing chores for Henry, and says as Doc Pratt and Crazy Johnny should help lay out the body. Doc always did say as how he thought Henry talked too much, boasting what a fine workman he was and how lucky it was that Stillwater had a regular undertaker instead of burying folks just as they was, like they do over to Whitby. "Suppose," says he, "some fellow was to be took with some of them paralysing cramps like you read about. How'd a body like it when they lowered him down and begun shoveling the dirt back? How'd he like it when he was choking down there under the new headstone, scratching and tearing if he chanced to get back the power? But all the time knowing it wasn't no use. No, sir, I tell you it's a blessing Stillwater's got a smart doctor as knows when a man's dead and when he ain't, and a trained undertaker who can fix a corpse so he'll stay put without no trouble." That was the way Henry went on talking, most like he was talking to poor Tom's remains, and old Doc Pratt, he didn't like what he was able to catch of it, even though Henry did call him a smart doctor. Crazy Johnny kept watching of the corpse, and it didn't make it none too pleasant the way he'd slobber about things like, "He ain't cold, Doc," or "I see his eyelids move," or "There's a hole in his arm just like the ones I get when Henry gives me a syringe full of what makes me feel good." Thorndyke shut him up on that, though we all knowed he'd been giving poor Johnny drugs. It's a wonder the poor fellow ever got clear of the habit. But the worst thing, according to the doctor, was the way the body jerked up when Henry begun to shoot it full of embalming fluid. He'd been boasting about what a fine new formula he'd got practicing on cats and dogs, when all of a sudden Tom's corpse began to double up like it was alive and fixing to wrestle. Land of Goshen, but Doc says he was scared stiff, though he knowed the way corpses act when the muscles begin to stiffen. Well, sir, the long and short of it is that the corpse sat up and grabbed a holt of Thorndyke's syringe so that it got stuck in Henry hisself, and give him as neat a dose of his own embalming fluid as you'd wish to see. That got Henry pretty scared, though he yanked the point out and managed to get the body down again and shot full of the fluid. He kept measuring more of the stuff out as though he wanted to be sure there was enough, and kept reassuring himself as not much had got into him. But Crazy Johnny begun singing out, "That's what you give Lige Hopkins' dog," when it got all dead and stiff and then waked up again. "Now you're a-going to get dead and stiff like Tom Sprague be. Remember, it don't set to work till after a long spell if you don't get much." Sophie, she was downstairs with some of the neighbours. My wife Matilde, she that's dead and gone this 30 year, was one of them. They were all trying to find out whether Thorndyke was over when Tom came home and whether finding him there was what set poor Tom off. I may as well say, as some folks thought it mighty funny that Sophie didn't carry on more, nor mind the way Thorndyke had smiled. Not as anybody was hinting that Henry helped Tom off with some of his queer, cooked-up fluids and syringes, or that Sophie would keep still if she thought so. But you know how folks will guess behind a body's back. We all knowed the nigh crazy way Thorndyke had hated Tom, not without reason at that. And Emily Barber says to my Matilde as how Henry was lucky to have old Doc Pratt right on the spot with a death certificate as didn't leave no doubt for nobody. When old Calvin gets to this point, he usually begins to mumble indistinguishably in his straggling, dirty white beard. Most listeners try to edge away from him, and he seldom appears to heed the gesture. It is generally Fred Peck, who was a very small boy at the time of the events, who continues the tale. Thomas Sprague's funeral was held on Thursday, June 17th, only 2 days after his death. Such haste was thought almost indecent in remote and inaccessible Stillwater, where long distances had to be covered by those who came, but Thorndyke had insisted that the peculiar condition of the deceased demanded it. The undertaker had seemed rather nervous since preparing the body, and could be seen frequently feeling his pulse. Old Dr. Pratt thought he must be worrying about the accidental dose of embalming fluid. Naturally, the story of the laying out had spread, so that a double zest animated the mourners who assembled to glut their curiosity and morbid interest. Thorndyke, though he was obviously upset, seemed intent on doing his professional duty in magnificent style. Sophie and others who saw the body were most startled by its utter lifelikeness, and the mortuary virtuoso made doubly sure of his job by repeating certain injections at stated intervals. He almost wrung a sort of reluctant admiration from the townsfolk and visitors, though he tended to spoil that impression by his boastful and tasteless talk. Whenever he administered to his silent charge, he would repeat that eternal rambling about the good luck of having a first-class undertaker. What, he would say, as if directly addressing the body, if Tom had had one of those careless fellows who bury their subjects alive. The way he harped on the horrors of premature burial was truly barbarous and sickening.